Hello. Age of Sigmar went through a tumultuous time during its first edition, having been created by executive mandate, rushed through production, and focused more on impressive miniatures than on creating a compelling world or robust rules. The game's launch had been a difficult time for Games Workshop and for fantasy fans, but over those first few years, changes would be made that would appease some fans and entice others, and go some way to establishing the game as a stable successor to Warhammer. AOS still had a long journey ahead of it, but by rethinking core design principles, embracing the community, and making things a lot more pointy, the game would reverse its fortunes. All of that culminating in a single release that was an inflection point in the way the game was played and the way it was perceived. The General's Handbook would be a momentous shift for the Age of Sigmar. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're continuing to chart the evolutions of the first edition of Age of Sigmar. In order to turn around the fate of their new fantasy game, Games Workshop would make decisions and choices that might have seemed inconceivable just a few years earlier. They would embrace the community in a way that they hadn't done for decades. They would release free rules and updates, and they would pour a considerable amount of creativity and money into this ambitious project. The launch of AOS was not a resounding success. Besides the bad will that had been generated by the cancellation of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, the game had drawn criticism for its lightweight approach, a focus on miniatures over rules, a lack of background and lore that people could invest in, no points values or balance for the game, and silly rules that betrayed a lack of seriousness. Designer Jervis Johnson summed things up pretty concisely. After Age of Sigmar came out, it was clear that it didn't work. The decisions that had been made about not having points values and lots of other things just didn't click. Many of these failures seem to be attributable to Games Workshop's leadership holding an overriding business principle, that miniatures were more important than an exciting gameplay experience or an immersive world. The models were what sold games, not the games themselves. If you haven't watched my video on the making of Age of Sigmar, the first part is right here. It's worth watching before we get into the details of the evolution, because I explore in more detail all of those challenges that were engendered by that mindset, and how it affected the creation and launch of the game. It wasn't all doom and gloom though. For some, the 4-page rule set was an artifact of elegance that is even today regarded as the basis of some exceptional games design. The wide open space of the Mortal Realms offered some people a blank canvas, one that could be populated with their own fantasy stories. And despite the misgivings of some, the Stormcast had quickly become a poster faction just as they had been intended, in the same way as their Space Marine ancestors were for 40k. Over the coming years, Games Workshop would turn its formidable resources towards the success of Age of Sigmar. They wanted it to be not just a successful game, but also a long-standing and successful IP. They were all in on AOS, and it showed. But before we get into the next step in that journey, I just wanted to remind you that I am supported here on the channel by my patrons, and if you would like to support the work I do as well, you can check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. It is enormously helpful, it ensures that I can continue to do this research and make these videos, and you get exclusive access to early content and some exclusive content, to my Discord, to updates on all of the work that I'm doing, and really, much like AOS itself, I am only here because of the community, so I am greatly appreciative of anything you can do to support me. At launch, the setting for AOS was considered by many to be lacking in detail and depth. The maps seemed empty, the cities unpopulated, and the stakes nebulous. To start to counter this perception, the doors opened once again on the Black Library. An Age of Sigmar primer was released that sought to summarise and expand on the broad lore of AOS and the Mortal Realms. But it was for the 10-part saga, the Realmgate Wars, that a considerable amount of early fiction for the Age of Sigmar was written. featuring novellas, novels, and short stories by an array of long-standing Black Library fiction writers such as Josh Reynolds, Nick Kime, and Guy Haley. These stories would chart the crushing victories of chaos, the quest to rediscover the legendary hammer of Sigmar, Galmaraz, and the various states of play for the different forces fighting across the mortal realms. Meanwhile, on the tabletop, the faction-specific rulebook that had been the Warhammer Armies book and for 40k the Codex would continue with Age of Sigmar, and this time they would be called Battle Tomes. In the first few months of 2016, there were a series of Battle Tome releases, one for each of the newly categorized high-level factions: Chaos, Death, Order, Destruction. Each one included very brief background notes, and then updated war scrolls for all of the current factions in AOS. These books marked the move away from the legacy war scrolls that had been made freely available at launch, superseding some and excising others. These were still largely legacy factions and units, but there was an increasing focus on renaming and rebranding them for this new world. It was around the time of the release of those books that it became clear that the Tomb Kings and the Bretonnians were no longer going to be supported by Games Workshop. They were just not part of the Age of Sigmar setting. As those armies left the store, so too did a whole range of plastic kits and characters for many of the other legacy armies. But despite this, there were still more factions in Age of Sigmar than probably any other game at any other time in Games Workshop's history. There were 22 sub-factions for the Alliance of Order alone, and many, many, many more for Chaos, Destruction, and Death. Shortly after the game's launch, the starter box factions had received their first battle tomes, with the Stormcast and Khorne Bloodbound delivering the standard army book style contents of background, timelines, sub-factions, paint schemes, scenarios, unit stats, and a lot of miniature photography. These were sizable books compared to some 40k codexes in certain editions, often running to over 120 pages. There was considerable clear effort in trying to establish the character of these factions and how they fit within this new Age of Sigmar setting. But even despite that page count, there was something unusual missing from these books. Not just the points, but also the credits. It was during this era that Games Workshop became more committed to their policy to not credit creatives on the products that they had designed. Each battle tome was attributed to Games Workshop itself, with the, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, quite Apple-esque credit, designed by Games Workshop in Nottingham. There are a lot of theories and potential explanations about why Games Workshop may have decided to remove individual credits from books like the battle tomes. Now, this is not the video to go into detail about that decision, but what I will say is that as someone who researches these things for a living, and as a hobbyist who loves these books and these games, it has always given me great joy being able to see the actual names of the people responsible for creating the things that I love, and to follow their journey as creators, to identify, to hear from, to recognize the individuals who were responsible for creating many of these great works. Well, I just think that's a joy, and it's a shame that it's harder to do that these days. Plus, it makes making videos like this a lot more difficult. The Lizardmen would be the first legacy army to receive an AOS battle tome, and like for the new factions that had come before them, a great deal of work had been invested to make these a race distinct from their ancestors, and a part of this new setting. The Seraphon, as they were called, were detailed as a race of space-dwelling angels of order that could be summoned into battle by their great mages, the Slann. In many ways, this was a natural extension or exaggeration of the Slann background that dated right back to the original editions of Warhammer Fantasy, and much as the Stormcast were drawing on some of the long-lost lore that suggested angels of law, these fantasy space lizards would act in opposition to the demons of chaos. Alongside the battle tomes and the new miniatures that were being released for the game, there was also a marketing innovation that would make it way more accessible and a lot cheaper as well. The age of the Start Collecting box had begun. At the beginning of 2016, AOS and 40k would each receive several new army bundle boxes, with the Age of Sigmar sets primarily centered around the legacy factions. Each box was a terrific deal, retailing at around £50 or £60, and including a centerpiece model, hero, and a unit or two, which typically cost more to buy separately. This was just one of many moves that Games Workshop made to create a more enticing jumping in point for potential new players. Another one was the reintroduction of the GW boxed game, board games and one-off releases that had fallen by the wayside in more recent times. They would reintroduce, as an Age of Sigmar tie-in, one of the most classic of Games Workshop's boxed games, and with it they would create probably, possibly, potentially, one of the greatest GW box games ever made, Warhammer Quest: Silver Tower. Designed by James Hewitt, who would also develop AOS board game Gore Chosen, this new Warhammer Quest game would fully lean into the truly fantastic rock album cover madness that was the Age of Sigmar, introducing quirky and cantankerous rules that perfectly matched the character of the enigmatic chaos god Tzeentch. These rules were very much the positive counterpoint to the whimsical but often frustrating special rules that had been introduced in the initial War Scroll compendiums, and they would be thematically echoed in forthcoming battle tomes like the Disciples of Tzeentch. Much like the Fyreslayers, the Tzeentch range was fully updated with many reimagined or completely whole cloth new units. The new cultists, the Carrick Acolytes, seem to draw on almost Ray Harryhausen and Grecian influences. The infinite recursion of Tzeentch horrors was given a playfully diminutive new Brimstone stage. Zangor Beastmen returned to the tabletop, and blue Sorcerous Minotaur men joined the fray as well. Oddly enough though, some miniatures from the Silver Tower never seemed to make it into their respective factions at large. Notably, the many-limbed grot scuttlings who infest the tower, like an unwanted pest, seemed to be forever entrapped within it. Silver Tower would be the first in a series of new quest games that explored different locales within the Age of Sigmar setting, and even 40k. And they would soon be joined by another series of small boxed games that would focus on accessibility, collectability, and ease of play. I'll not delve further into Warhammer Underworlds or Warcry here, but it is worth noting that they would become an interesting sales mechanism for GW, and would again serve to deepen the lore for the setting, such as through explorations of the haunted city of Shadespire and the chaotic crossroads of the 8 Points. Larger-than-life, almost cinematic backdrops for the outlandish, unending fantasy combat of the Age of Sigmar. The community had become an ever more important aspect of the fantasy hobby since the cancellation of Warhammer. For some, it was the valiant community-led initiatives like the Warhammer Armies project and its 9th edition of the game that kept fantasy alive. For others, it was the no less valiant attempt to stabilize and balance Age of Sigmar so that it could support competitive strategic play. With no official points values built into Age of Sigmar's original release, there was something of a vacuum when it came to fair, competitive play. If you wanted to go to your local store for a pickup game against a stranger, how could you have any faith that there would actually be a fair match for you to play? Armies were not balanced. There was no way in which to actually measure the strength of your force against the strength of another. For some people, there were ways around this, by counting the total wounds across your armies, by counting the total models, but it still left very little ability to actually balance games of Age of Sigmar. In more structured environments like tournaments, this was even more of a problem. There needed to be some way to balance the relative strength of each army that was competing in the event. So they started using something called comp packs, which were different systems developed to basically build the armies at a level of relative strength, to balance them using, oftentimes, points values. There were lots of different comp packs available, lots of them designed in different ways. One such system was SCGT, the South Coast Grand Tournament Pack, developed by some of the members of the Heel and Hammer podcast. Dan Heelan, one of the co-hosts of that podcast, was actually invited by the Warhammer community to write about his time playing Age of Sigmar during that era. I've always been a competitive guy, so the tournament treadmill of trying to better yourself at each event obviously sat well with me. But with the switch to AOS, I have personally found myself back where I started, playing for playing's sake. The two are not mutually exclusive, but the wealth of narrative material and early lack of a points system has certainly helped me rediscover the love for that part of the hobby. One of the best things about running such a large tournament and being involved in a worldwide community of hobbyists is being able to see just how differently groups enjoy the hobby, none of which is right or wrong. AOS is the perfect toolbox for enjoying it how you want it. One of the most popular and widely adopted comp packs in the UK was known as Clash Comp, or by some it was known after the name of its creator, Mo, as MoComp. Mo had gone to the trouble of assigning points values to every single unit in the game, and working with an advisory council, they had actually created a more robust system for army selection. As all-round good egg Rob, the honest wargamer, poetically describes it in his primer on AOS, which I've linked down below. It's an excellent video and really worth a watch. This was akin to when Sigmar himself had created a pantheon of the gods to bring order to the chaos. Now, if, like me, you didn't historically pay a lot of attention to the development of competitive gaming for Games Workshop's games, then this could sound a bit hyperbolic. It was, after all, just people playing tournament games. But it wasn't just that, because whilst the competitive scene had embraced and evolved Age of Sigmar, Games Workshop had been watching, and they would soon embrace the competitive scene and evolve the game according to what they'd witnessed, because they were about to do something that hadn't really been done before, and I don't think has been done since either. Games Workshop would invite the competitive scene into the design studio. The General's Handbook was released in 2016, and for many reasons it marked a significant shift in the landscape of AOS, shifts that would set the tone for the rest of this first edition and lay the foundations for the next. It would reintroduce game balancing through points values, and clearly articulated a game-playing principle that Jervis Johnson had been developing for the better part of his career. Jervis Johnson has spoken a little bit about some of the lessons he felt were learned after the disastrous launch of the game, and which would go on to inform the creation of the General's Handbook. As a games designer, the important thing it did, and it was a very important lesson for Workshop at that time, was that it made it clear that the rules are actually very important. They are not just an adjunct to the miniatures, and being able to collect an army with points values is an essential element. So then we had to go on from that first version and quickly evolve it, and it was during that process of rapid evolution that quite a lot of the initial restraints were taken off. To me, it all felt quite familiar and was quite old school. The leadership at Games Workshop had changed in the early days of Age of Sigmar's release. The managerial team, who had played down the importance of gameplay and rules in the second place, and had been so adamant to create AOS in the first, were no longer steering the ship. There was a new helmsman for the Age of Sigmar, and the light they were sailing towards was the community. People like Pete Foley took over the studio. He's a long-time tournament player, and he pulled it back towards something that would appeal to the gamers. So what happened was that the General's Handbook was the first big thing that Pete's studio worked on. This General's Handbook would structure itself around 3 key ways to play. The 3 ways to play was, simply put, an explicit definition and explanation of the different mindsets that gamers might bring to the table when they wanted to play the game. Open play, narrative play, and matched play. Open play games allow for the broadest choice of army selection, allowing the greatest freedom for collecting miniatures and building an army. With so much scope for fun and creativity, open play is one of the most accessible and enjoyable gaming styles. Designed for beginners, those just getting started with a new collection, or perhaps wanting to test out a given unit or two. Open play was very much about taking whatever miniatures you had or wanted to use and putting them on the table to roll some dice and have some fun. In many ways, it continued the spirit that was found in that first edition launch box for Age of Sigmar. Narrative play, on the other hand, was all about telling stories with your games, introducing themed battles and campaigns. It still didn't dwell on points, and instead focused on creating perhaps uneven games that would help you to tell interesting stories and from which dramatic, compelling narratives could emerge. While narrative play games allow you to assemble your army based on a theme or story, and open play games enable you to include any models you like, matched play games give you the option to fight battles with forces that are intentionally balanced against one another. You will find detailed additional rules for taking part in a tournament, as well as a comprehensive points-based system that assigns a value to every unit available in the Warhammer Age of Sigmar range. Jervis Johnson didn't develop the General's Handbook in an isolated vacuum though. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Games Workshop, having seen how impressive and innovative competitive play had been for companies like Privateer Press with their War Machine game, they'd actually been looking at the competitive scene for Age of Sigmar. They'd seen how MoComp had become popular and how it had been adopted widely, and rather than start from scratch, they actually brought members of the community, the competitive scene, into the design room to help them playtest the creation of the General's Handbook. Dan and Wayne from Heel and Hammer, Dan Curry from the Bad Dice podcast, and Russ from Facehammer were all prominent figures in the AOS community, organising tournaments and releasing regular podcasts about the game. And they were amongst the community members who were invited to join Jervis Johnson at Warhammer World to help playtest the new rules for the General's Handbook that was being developed. Over a short but intense period, the game was put through its competitive paces, and feedback gathered from the attendees to help ensure that the matched play rules and the pitched battles contained in the book were comprehensive, effective, and above all, balanced. Having set down the philosophy behind 3 ways to play, Johnson felt that it allowed for considerably more freedom in rules design, and it accounted for the different markets of gamers that Games Workshop was keen to court. Miniatures first gamers could easily use anything from their collection in open play. More complexity could be found in the narrative game in a way reminiscent of the early editions of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. And of course, matched play enabled the type of game that had dominated play through the 90s and 2000s. In fact, the 3 ways to play approach proved so successful that it would soon find its way into 40k as well. The matched play system hewed closely to the MoComp and some other systems that had been developed in the tournament scene, and it had already been adopted by Johnson in the rapid development of the General's Handbook by the time community members from the competitive space were invited in for playtesting. But that invitation acted both as a check on the development process and a terrific PR opportunity for the increasingly transparent and open Warhammer community team. This was a statement that the workshop was doing the work to, for want of a better word, fix the Age of Sigmar, and that gameplay was going to be at the heart of this new outlook. As well as all of that innovation, there was also the inclusion of tournament-friendly scenarios, and something else: Grand Alliance allegiance abilities. These were, at the Grand Alliance level, special rules and capabilities that you could use in-game, much like battalion special rules. These would emerge for all of the factions in the game in later battle tomes, and they became a cornerstone of army development for Age of Sigmar. And whilst the ways to play and the rules for creating armies to play with were changing, the story for the Age of Sigmar was changing as well. It was moving forward with the introduction of a brand new mega event, campaign book, and series of stories. This was the Malign portents. Shadows lengthen across the mortal realms. In every nation, from its ramshackle hovels to its soaring keeps, dark omens abound. The elders say there is change on the wind, and not for the better. Sigmar's great endeavour to light the fires of civilization once more has borne fruit, but in turn brought dangers of its own. Over the course of several months, new fiction was published on a dedicated website, advancing the story of Nagash and his nefarious plans to take power over the Realm of Death by gathering up all of the Shishian Realmstone, though to what end was not entirely clear. A new campaign book and card pack were released, and there was also a global campaign to support the event, with players given the ability to log their victories on the website. Emphasis was placed on using deathly special rules, and introducing the portentous characters of the Harbingers, who had seen dark visions come to pass. The miniatures range continued to expand and evolve, and by summer 2018, the Caradron Overlords, Maggotkin of Nurgle, Legions of Nagash, Daughters of Cain, and finally, Idoneth Deepkin had all been released. Over the course of the game's first 3-year cycle, Games Workshop had managed to recover from some of the unforced errors that had accompanied Age of Sigmar's original release. The reintroduction of points and balance, the removal of frilly, silly rules, and the embrace of the competitive scene had actually shown that Games Workshop and the game's designers were intent on creating a serious gameplay experience, a legitimate game that could act as a successor to Warhammer Fantasy. And they also showed that everything didn't begin and end with beautiful miniatures.
What Age of Sigmar 1 showed was that, yes, the second theory is right. Like the idea that the game rules and points values stop you collecting miniatures is completely wrong. So you can really see it just changing very, very quickly. It was proved. It wasn't a theory. It was a theory. It was proved wrong. So quickly we were like, okay, games design team, you idiots! Why didn't you put points values in? Often sort that out straight away. So we went out and we did that, and cool stuff started to come out of it. The 3 ways to play, which I think is for later Games Workshop, one of the most important kind of evolutionary steps in the way that you look at a miniatures game and a set of rules. That you, instead of saying we're going to try and write one set of rules that does everything, you say we'll have what's core fundamental principles, but then actually you can explore these in these different ways, and they've each got their own sets of rules which are tailored for that style of play.
Bringing the community into the development process was seen as a major step forward, as had the acquisition of the War Scroll Builder fan-made app. And the increasingly active Games Workshop social media team showed that there was more of an appetite at GW for embracing and speaking with the community who played their games. By the end of the edition, the design studio had been recentered around the development of specific games, with teams working just on that one line. Jervis Johnson was responsible for the rules for Age of Sigmar, and Phil Kelly was the creative lead responsible for the story. All of this together felt like GW were making more of the right moves more often. The vast emptiness of the Mortal Realms was beginning to slowly become populated, with each battle tome introducing new factions, characters, and stories that actually gave depth to this world. There were more stakes because there were more people in the universe to invest in. And Malign portents had created some kind of forward momentum, a bridge in the story that would go from the first edition to the second edition that would release later in 2018. That would continue the story of Malign portents with the Soul Wars. But that's a conversation and an exploration for another time. By the end of the first edition of Age of Sigmar, it had taken a great many great strides past the faltering missteps of its launch. There was now a much more immersive story and a world that had a lot more character and a lot more to invest in. It was far from perfect and still not as deep as the 30-year development that Warhammer Fantasy had had, but there was clear effort in trying to craft something that was more interesting and more immersive. The rules had been refined. There had been the reintroduction of points and balance that enabled lots of different ways to play the game. And it was just very clear that Games Workshop were pouring investment into Age of Sigmar, whether that was the core game or the ancillary releases that supported it and deepened it. In some ways, when you look at how the game first started, the tumult in which it was announced and released, it's kind of difficult to imagine that it would have made its way to the precipice of a second edition at all. And yet, it also seems inevitable that it would make it to that second edition because of just how much effort and investment was put into it. Games Workshop had to make sure it succeeded because they had bet everything on it. And so, with all of that work and a team who clearly loved this property and would do anything to make sure that it succeeded and would become much loved, it was clear that Age of Sigmar was going into its second edition with a lot more going for it than it had first arrived. The second edition, of course, would bring with it plenty of changes of its own. And as Age of Sigmar continued on to new heights, Nagash would go deeper and deeper than ever before. I hope that you enjoyed this exploration of the making of Age of Sigmar and how it evolved over the course of its first edition. I certainly had a lot of fun investigating a lot of this stuff. There are aspects of it that I'm not that close to and wasn't that close to during the time. So if I've got anything wrong or I've missed anything essential, please leave a comment down below. I would love to hear from you. I would also love to hear from anybody who was playing Age of Sigmar or Warhammer Fantasy during this period. What are your reflections on that first couple of years of Age of Sigmar? By the time it had ended, how did you feel about it? And again, as ever, please remain civil, remain polite. I know that this can be a contentious topic at times, but I think we're all here because we're interested in the history of these games that we enjoy. Thanks once again go out to Goonhammer for their excellent reporting on Age of Sigmar, to Wrinkletooth on Reddit for making an amazing documented history of Age of Sigmar's releases, for the incredible resource that is Talking Miniatures, which I've put a link to down in the description below, and of course to the fine fellows at Heel and Hammer, Bad Dice Podcast, and Facehammer. If you would like to support the work that I do here on the channel, please consider checking out my Patreon via the link in the description below. It's the only way I can keep doing this. I have an exclusive Discord, I release early access content and some exclusive content. I'm doing monthly giveaways for the rest of this year. You can win Warhammer Quest Lost Relics if you get there quickly. And there's other cool stuff like a GW Books Club, live streams, all of that good stuff. And I greatly, greatly appreciate any help that you are able to offer if you can. I am also hugely appreciative of anybody who can like and share this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't, because that's enormously important as well. In the coming weeks, I am hoping to release a video about the first few expansions, the supplements for Rogue Trader, and how they helped to evolve that game into the 40k that we know and love today. And I'm also hoping that should the dwarves of the old world turn up, that I will be able to do a history of those dwarves and how they've changed and evolved over the years as well. And one final plug, I've recently launched the GW Films Club. It's got its own YouTube channel. It's a really cool podcast, I think it's really cool, where my friend Rob and I talk about the films that have been cited by the creators of Games Workshop's games as major influences on those worlds and those games themselves. So we talk about all of those influences, how we think those films have informed the worlds that we love, and the first episode is about Dune, the David Lynch adaptation from 1984, and a couple of other Dune adaptations as well. I thought it was a really fun episode. You can check that out on GW Films Club. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. You know, it was actually Silver Tower that convinced me to give the Age of Sigmar another look. I hadn't really fallen in love with the setting until I played that game. And boy, is that game amazing.